What if you were celebrating, laughing, drinking, completely convinced that nothing could touch you, when suddenly a human hand appeared out of nowhere and began writing your judgment on the wall? No body, no visible person, only fingers, writing words no one in the room could understand. And before that night was over, the king would be dead, and one of the greatest kingdoms of the ancient world would fall. This is not a legend. This is the terrifying account recorded in Daniel chapter 5. And the most disturbing part of the story is not merely that a mysterious hand appeared, it is why it appeared. Because according to Daniel, the king had already been given a warning. He knew what God had done before him, but he refused to humble his heart. And then the hand appeared. Daniel chapter 5 opens with a celebration. Scripture says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Imagine the scene. A magnificent royal hall, 1,000 nobles gathered before the king. Food, wine, music, power, luxury. Everything around Belshazzar proclaimed the greatness of Babylon. And Belshazzar was not hiding. He was celebrating. But then, he made a decision that transformed this feast into something far more serious. While tasting the wine, Belshazzar commanded that certain vessels be brought into the feast. But these were not ordinary drinking vessels. Scripture says, Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. Daniel chapter 5, verse 2. These vessels had come from the temple in Jerusalem, objects associated with the worship of the God of Israel. And now Belshazzar brought them into his drunken celebration. The king, his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. But the story becomes even darker. Daniel chapter 5 verse 4 says, They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Think about what was happening. They were drinking from vessels taken from the temple of God, while praising gods made by human hands. Gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, stone. And then, something appeared that no one at the feast could control. Scripture says, In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaister of the wall of the king's palace. Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. Stop there. Not the figure of a man, not an army entering the hall, not even a voice from heaven. Fingers, the fingers of a man's hand, writing on the wall. And Scripture adds one chilling detail. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Belshazzar saw it. This was not something reported to him later. The king himself watched the hand writing. Imagine the celebration stopping, the music falling silent, the laughter disappearing, every eye turning toward the wall, and Belshazzar, the powerful king, was terrified. Daniel describes his reaction. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Daniel chapter 5, verse 6. Moments earlier, he was drinking before 1,000 nobles. Now his face had changed. His thoughts terrified him. His strength failed him, and his knees struck against each other. But there was another problem. Words had been written on the wall. and Belshazzar did not understand what they meant. The king cried aloud for the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. He promised an extraordinary reward. Whoever could read the writing and explain its meaning would be clothed in scarlet, wear a chain of gold, and become the third ruler in the kingdom. Then the wise men of Babylon entered. These were the experts, the educated, the advisors, the men expected to understand mysteries. But Scripture says, "Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof." Daniel chapter 5, verse 8. Think about the irony. Babylon possessed wealth, military strength, political power, religious experts, astrologers, wise men. But when judgment appeared on the wall, none of them could explain it. And Belshazzar became even more terrified. Scripture says, "Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonied." The feast had become a scene of confusion, until someone remembered a man who had interpreted mysteries before. His name was Daniel. The queen entered and told Belshazzar about Daniel. She described a man in whom, during the days of Nebuchadnezzar, had been found extraordinary wisdom and understanding. Daniel was brought before the king. Belshazzar offered him the same reward: scarlet clothing, a golden chain, authority in the kingdom. But Daniel was not impressed. His answer was remarkable. "Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation." Daniel chapter 5, verse 17. Daniel did not begin by interpreting the words. First, he told Belshazzar something he desperately needed to hear. He reminded him of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel told Belshazzar that the Most High God had given Nebuchadnezzar a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honor. Nations trembled before him. His authority was enormous. But Nebuchadnezzar's heart became lifted up. His mind hardened in pride, and God humbled him. He was removed from his throne. His glory was taken from him. He was driven from men, until he learned something every ruler eventually must understand: that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. Daniel chapter 5, verse 21. Then Daniel turned the lesson directly toward Belshazzar, and this may be the most important verse in the entire story. Daniel said, "And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this." Daniel chapter 5, verse 22. Though thou knewest all this. Belshazzar was not being confronted as someone who had never received a warning. Daniel said he knew. He knew what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He knew how pride had brought humiliation. He knew that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of men, and still, he refused to humble himself. Instead, Daniel said, "But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven." Then Daniel confronted exactly what had happened at the feast. The vessels from God's house had been brought before Belshazzar. The king and his company had drunk wine from them, and they had praised gods that could neither see, nor hear, nor know. Then Daniel said something devastating. "And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified." Daniel chapter 5, verse 23. Think about those words. Belshazzar had been praising gods made of gold and silver, but his own breath was in the hand of the living God. The king believed he controlled the feast. He believed he controlled the palace. He believed he controlled his kingdom. But Daniel reminded him, even your next breath belongs to God. And then Daniel explained why the hand had appeared. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. Now, the mystery would be revealed. Daniel read the writing. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, UPHARSIN. 4 terrifying words. Then he began interpreting them. First, MENE. Daniel said, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Daniel chapter 5, verse 26. Numbered. Finished. Belshazzar was still sitting on the throne. The palace still belonged to Babylon. The feast was still taking place. The nobles were still gathered. But according to the message on the wall, the kingdom had already been numbered. Its time had run out. Imagine hearing those words while still wearing the crown. You think tomorrow belongs to you. God says, your kingdom is finished. Then came the second word, TEKEL. Daniel interpreted it. Thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Daniel chapter 5, verse 27. Belshazzar had probably been measured by many human standards. Power, wealth, position, influence, royal blood. But now, another measurement mattered. God's. The king had been placed upon the scales and found wanting. That is one of the most sobering statements in Scripture, because human beings often measure themselves against other human beings. Am I better than that person? Am I more successful, more powerful, more respected? But Belshazzar's story presents a completely different question. What happens when God does the weighing? Then Daniel came to the final word, Paris. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel chapter 5, verse 28. Not, your kingdom might fall. Not, your enemies may eventually defeat you. Daniel announced that the kingdom was being given away. Belshazzar's feast had become his judgment. The writing was complete. The interpretation had been given. And then something extraordinary happened. Belshazzar commanded that Daniel be clothed with scarlet. A chain of gold was placed around his neck, and proclamation was made that Daniel should be the third ruler in the kingdom. But think about the tragic irony. What value is promotion? Inside a kingdom God has just declared finished. Daniel had received the honor. But Babylon had almost no time left, because Daniel chapter 5 ends with 2 of the most chilling verses in the entire account. Scripture says, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. Daniel chapter 5, verse 30. That night. The chapter began with a feast. It ends with the death of the king. The man who had raised a cup in celebration did not survive the night. The man who praised gods of gold and silver could not command his own next breath. The man surrounded by 1,000 nobles could not prevent the judgment written on the wall. And then the final verse says, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Daniel chapter 5, verse 31. The kingdom changed hands, just as the writing had declared. Babylon's celebration had become Babylon's final night under Belshazzar. It would be easy to hear Daniel chapter 5 merely as an ancient story about the fall of a king. But Daniel himself tells us what the real issue was: pride. Belshazzar had been given knowledge. He had an example before him. He knew what happened when Nebuchadnezzar exalted himself. Yet Daniel told him, "Thou hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this." That changes the entire story. The handwriting on the wall did not appear without context. Belshazzar had been warned by history. He knew, but knowledge without humility did not save him. He continued to exalt himself, and Daniel said he had failed to glorify the God in whose hand thy breath is. That message reaches far beyond ancient Babylon, because every human being lives with the same reality. Our breath is not ultimately ours. Our days are not unlimited. Power does not make us immortal. Money does not make us immortal. Success does not make us immortal. Even kings die. There is something haunting about the first word, MENE. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. We naturally live as though there will always be another day, another year, another opportunity, another chance to change. Belshazzar probably did not begin that evening thinking, "Tonight I will die." He planned a feast. He invited 1,000 nobles. He drank. He celebrated. Everything suggested there would be a tomorrow, but there wasn't. Scripture says elsewhere, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth." Proverbs chapter 27, verse 1. Daniel chapter 5 gives us a terrifying picture of that truth. Belshazzar had plans for the evening. God knew the number of his kingdom. Then there is TEKEL. Thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Imagine standing before God with everything stripped away. No title, no followers, no bank account, no reputation, no comparison with another human being. Only you, before the God who knows everything. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 says, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment." Belshazzar's story reminds us that earthly status cannot prevent that appointment. The question is not simply, how do people see me? The deeper question is, how does God see me? But perhaps Daniel's most powerful statement is this, "And the God in whose hand thy breath is, hast thou not glorified?" Every breath Belshazzar took during that feast was permitted by the God he refused to glorify. Every word he spoke required another breath. Every cup he lifted required strength God had allowed him to possess. And while Belshazzar praised lifeless gods, the living God held his breath. There is something deeply humbling about that. Right now, your heart is beating. Your lungs are breathing. You are alive, not because you control tomorrow, but because life itself is a gift. Acts chapter 17, verse 25 says that God giveth to all life and breath and all things. Belshazzar possessed a kingdom, but he did not possess his own breath. Neither do we. And perhaps this is the detail we should remember most. God had already shown Belshazzar something through Nebuchadnezzar. Pride had brought that mighty ruler down. Nebuchadnezzar eventually confessed, "Those that walk in pride he is able to abase." Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. Belshazzar knew the story, yet he repeated the pride. That is why Daniel's words are so serious. "Though thou knewest all this." Sometimes the greatest danger is not ignorance. It is knowing the truth and refusing to respond to it. Belshazzar had the warning. Then came the writing. So imagine that palace one final time. The tables, the wine, the golden vessels, the 1,000 nobles, the king seated in power. Then a hand appears. The fingers begin moving across the wall. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, UPHARSIN. The room falls silent. Daniel enters, and the meaning becomes clear. Your kingdom has been numbered. You have been weighed. Your kingdom will be divided. And before sunrise, Belshazzar is dead. Daniel chapter 5 is not merely asking us to be fascinated by a supernatural hand. It confronts us with something much more personal. Belshazzar knew, but he would not humble himself. So the question is not merely, what did the handwriting on the wall mean? The question is, what will we do with the truth God has already given us? Because one day, every kingdom ends. Every possession is left behind. Every human life reaches its final breath. But Scripture points us toward hope. Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." John chapter 3, verse 16. Belshazzar's story is a warning against pride. But the gospel is an invitation to humble ourselves, to turn to God, and to place our trust in Jesus Christ. Do not wait for handwriting on a wall. Do not assume tomorrow belongs to you. While you have breath, seek the God who gave it. And remember the words Daniel spoke to a king on the final night of his reign. "The God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified." Daniel chapter 5, verse 23. If you want more Bible mysteries, shocking biblical events, and Scripture explained in its context, follow and subscribe for more Bible-based truth.